Tiffany was working in the kitchen when she heard the front door open with a bang. Arthur must have returned from his business trip, she thought. She would have liked to go out and greet him, but right now her hands were covered in cream because Tiffany had been busy making a cake for several hours. It was quite a complicated order. The dessert had 3 tiers, each with a different flavor. She had been working on it from morning till evening, without even sitting down once. The bride had ordered the cake, wanting her wedding to be perfect. Tiffany agreed to take the order, even though she had received it rather late. She had to finish it by the next day, so she knew she would have to work late into the night. All right, I'll manage somehow. At least people will have a real celebration, she thought when she accepted the order. Tiffany was a pastry chef. She had once worked at a cafe, but after having children, she became a busy mother of several and started working from home in a specially equipped kitchen as a self-employed person. Arthur returned in a terrible mood. He had spent several days in another city, and when he came back, he received a scolding from his boss, who wasn't satisfied with the results of his trip. Arthur worked as a supply manager in the food industry. The bulk of his job involved traveling to different cities and purchasing raw materials for production. "Where's Tiffany?" he asked grumpily to his mother, who had come to greet him. "She's in the kitchen," Lauren Evans shook her head. Of course, Arthur said sarcastically, it must be so hard for her to come out and see her husband after spending the whole day at home. She'll fall apart if she does. His elderly mother sighed heavily. She didn't approve of her daughter-in-law's cake-making business, believing Tiffany should have found a proper job by now. The children were already in school and kindergarten, so there was no reason for Tiffany to stay home all day while her husband worked so hard at his job to support their large family. What's the point of baking cakes? Any fool can make a cake once a week, then sit back and do nothing, thought the mother-in-law disapprovingly, watching Tiffany. Both the mother and the son shared the opinion that Tiffany did nothing but spend her husband's hard-earned money. When Arthur appeared in the kitchen, Tiffany was finishing spreading cream on the second tier. "Arthur," she smiled. Then, carefully kissed her husband on the cheek so as not to get cream on him. "How did the business trip go?" "Productively," he replied. "I closed a few profitable deals." He skeptically scanned the kitchen. "What does she even do all day? Bakes a cake for fun and then sits around and relaxes?" "No. This won't do," he thought. Sometimes Arthur was irritated by the fact that Tiffany simply stayed at home and did what she loved. He thought it was unfair that he had to get up early every morning, while she could wake up whenever she wanted and plan her own day. "But you know," he continued, "I feel like I'm really tired." For effect, he slumped into a chair and started rubbing his temples as though he had a severe headache. "Maybe I should give you a pill," his wife asked, concerned, pushing the plate of cream aside. "And then you can lie down." "I'm not talking about that," Arthur waved his hand. "How would you feel about going on the next business trip instead of me?" Tiffany was taken aback by such a proposal. She knew what her husband did for a living and often gave him advice, since the food industry was something she was familiar with. But going on business negotiations herself? That was unthinkable. She wasn't sure she was ready for such responsibilities. "Is that even possible?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "After all, I'm not an employee of your company. Won't your boss mind sending an outsider on a business trip?" "I'll handle it with no problem," Arthur promised. "He knows you have the proper education," he held up one finger. "And besides, I have an excellent reputation, so if I vouch for you, no one will have any doubts about you," he raised a second finger. Tiffany thought deeply. She was sure this had something to do with her mother-in-law. Although her relationship with Lauren was decent, Arthur's mother never missed an opportunity to imply that her daughter-in-law's work was trivial and unimportant, and that it was time to find something else. Naturally, Tiffany felt hurt because she had put so much effort into building her reputation in the pastry world and gaining a client base, while Lauren so easily devalued all her hard work. However, Tiffany never engaged in open arguments, understanding that her husband's mother simply didn't grasp the reality of the situation. And also, Arthur continued, while you're away on the trip, I'll spend time with the kids. I've really missed them. It's scary to think about how long it's been since I took them anywhere. Tiffany couldn't help but smile. Once, she had been convinced that she was infertile, and now, she and Arthur had 3 wonderful children whom she adored. Their oldest son, Brad, they had adopted from an orphanage. He was now 6 and in 1st grade. Just 2 years after the adoption, Tiffany discovered that she was pregnant. She was incredibly happy to learn that she could still have children. That's when the twins, Jessica and Martha, were born. They were now 4 and attended preschool. Tiffany didn't differentiate between her adopted children and biological ones. She loved them all the same. All right, she agreed, if you insist, I'll go on your business trip. She had planned to rest since, due to the large number of orders, she had barely slept in the past few days. However, fate had made some serious changes to her plans. But it's fine, I'll catch up on sleep when I'm retired, Tiffany thought cheerfully, trying to finish the wedding cake as quickly as possible. When her mother-in-law found out about the news, she was overjoyed. Good job, son. That's a great idea, she said, patting Arthur on the back approvingly. And I'll stay with you. Lauren was pleased that she would be able to spend time with her grandchildren, and at least her daughter-in-law would work a little for the good of the family. Well, she can't just sit around all the time, living off her husband. It's time she did something for herself. Hardly having had time to rest, Tiffany delivered the cake to the clients and began preparing for the business trip. She was supposed to spend several days in a neighboring city and finalize a deal with partners for raw material supplies. It wasn't such an easy task, and Tiffany was noticeably nervous. She had never had this kind of experience before. She felt a heavy responsibility and was afraid of letting her husband down. It turned out that she would be traveling by car with a personal driver. His name was Gerald, and he was quite taciturn. In the past hour, he had said only a few words. Tiffany, who was naturally a talkative person, soon began to feel uncomfortable and tried to strike up a conversation with the driver. "How long have you been working here?" she asked. "A couple of years," came his brief reply, followed by a short pause. But Tiffany wasn't ready to give up yet. "And how's it going? Do you like it?" she asked again. Gerald smiled with just the corners of his mouth. Her awkward attempts to start a conversation with him amused him. "Quite," he replied again, briefly. Tiffany sighed heavily, anticipating a rather dull trip. She decided to take the initiative and began talking about herself and her life. Even though the driver offered only short comments, he listened to her with interest. Most of the time, Tiffany talked about her work as a pastry chef and, of course, about the children. "Partners will probably be surprised when they see me," she continued, "but Arthur promised there won't be any problems," and then she started talking about her husband. When she mentioned that Arthur was an outstanding supply manager and that everyone highly valued him, Gerald couldn't suppress a cynical chuckle. "Is something wrong?" Tiffany immediately reacted. No, everything's fine, sorry." Gerald quickly returned his gaze to the road. "Oh no, you don't get off that easily," she frowned. "Now, speak up." Reluctantly, the driver admitted that, in fact, her husband had quite a questionable reputation in the workplace. Almost all of his trips had been failures. Suppliers were unhappy with his work, and his boss had raised the issue of firing him more than once. At work, he was known as an unreliable and irresponsible person. Tiffany didn't know what to say. She was extremely surprised because her husband had told her a completely different story. "I'm the one holding our entire company together," Arthur had confidently said. "No one from the supply team brings in as many profitable contracts as I do. They're all clinging to me like drowning people clutching at a straw." And Tiffany had believed him, feeling immense pride in his successes at work. However, since Tiffany had some knowledge of the food industry, there were times when she had questions about Arthur's actions. Sometimes, it seemed to her that he was agreeing to strange terms, but since everyone at work seemed happy with him, she didn't focus on it. So Arthur was lying to me, she thought to herself, reflecting on the driver's words. Now, Tiffany viewed her husband's stories in a completely different light. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that, Gerald said apologetically, noticing how upset his passenger had become after his words. No, it's fine, Tiffany hurried to reassure him. What if Arthur purposely sent me instead of himself to improve his position in the company, she thought, then immediately shook her head. Well, it would be strange to rely on someone who's never been involved in anything like this. Although Tiffany knew a lot about raw materials, it was only theoretical knowledge. She had never actually been involved in the practical side. If she really thought about it, Arthur was indeed weak in the field of food production. He had an unfinished degree in a related field, and he got this job through connections because his relative once studied with the boss. Time was running short, so Gerald immediately took Tiffany to the negotiations, which were scheduled to take place at a small cafe. Since the parties rarely reached an agreement immediately, such business trips typically lasted several days. It was decided that after today's discussion, Tiffany would go to the hotel, from where she would either head to the next meeting or check the raw materials, depending on the situation. I'll wait in the car, the driver said as they arrived at the destination. Good luck. Tiffany swallowed hard. Taking a deep breath, she got out of the car and walked toward the designated table, where two distinguished men were already sitting. They had a slight advantage, as the negotiations were taking place on their turf. Good afternoon. Tiffany smiled politely as she took a seat. The men exchanged glances. Fragile, she didn't seem threatening. The partners silently agreed that she would be easy to convince to accept all their terms. In an attempt to win her over and throw her off course, they offered to treat her to coffee and compliment her with the most delicious dessert. Tiffany accepted all of this with a sweet smile and then asked them to provide all the necessary documents. Since she had knowledge in product science and often communicated with suppliers to purchase the ingredients for her cakes, she quickly realized that the terms they were trying to impose were completely unacceptable. No, we can't agree to this, she said firmly, pushing the dessert away. You're offering too large quantities, and some of these items we don't even need. Taking a pencil, Tiffany crossed off several ingredients from the list, then opened the calculator and calculated a new amount. These are the figures we're willing to work with, she said. The men exchanged bewildered glances. Each of them realized they had underestimated their counterpart. Yes, appearances can be very deceiving, one of them thought. You know, Arthur always agreed immediately, the second one reminded her, attempting to sway Tiffany to their side. We've been working together for many years. But I'm not Arthur, Tiffany replied in a businesslike tone. I've made my decision, and I'm not going to change it, she added, surprising herself. In everyday life, she was much softer, but when it came to the food industry, she couldn't afford to show any weakness. These people can think whatever they want about me, but I can't let unnecessary products into the company, she thought. The suppliers stepped away for a moment to discuss. Tiffany sighed, then took a small sip of her coffee. God, if I've messed this up, I won't be able to look my husband in the eye, she thought nervously, but outwardly she remained calm. Meanwhile, a dispute broke out between the two men. One argued that they should agree with Tiffany, while the other insisted that they should stand firm. They had found Arthur to be very convenient, but his wife had spoiled all their plans. Who would have thought that such an idiot would have such a smart wife, one of the men said regretfully. In the end, they realized they needed to agree. Tiffany was a professional who was hard to deceive. For once, the suppliers decided to act honestly, without tricks or provocations. This allowed them to close a deal that was especially beneficial for the company where Arthur worked. Meanwhile, while Tiffany was conquering the professional world, things at home weren't going so well. When Lauren came to visit her grandchildren, she found that the little ones were left to their own devices. Brad, where's your dad? She asked in surprise. I don't know, the boy shrugged. He said he had some errands to run, and I stayed to be the big one. The elderly woman was outraged. While her grandson could manage being alone for a short time, the girls were far too young, and leaving them alone for long was dangerous. She tried calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. "How long have you been on your own?" the grandmother asked. "Since morning," Brad replied. Lauren shook her head disapprovingly. Arthur had said he missed the kids and planned to spend the whole day with them, but now he had left them so carelessly. Maybe he had some urgent business at work. He's such a workaholic. Spends so much time in the office, she thought, reluctant to accuse her son. "Kids, did your dad at least leave you some food?" the grandmother asked. The little ones shook their heads. It turned out they had only drunk a glass of milk in the morning and hadn't eaten anything since. The grandmother was horrified. The time was already nearing evening, so they had practically gone the whole day without food. "Well, don't worry, my darlings," Lauren said with a smile. "Grandma will make you something now." "Do you cook as good as Mom?" one of the twins asked. "Yes, Mom makes food very tasty," the other twin confirmed. Lauren was pleasantly surprised by her daughter-in-law's culinary skills. She had assumed that Tiffany only knew how to bake a few kinds of cakes and nothing more. But the children eagerly listed all the dishes their mom spoiled them with. Lauren had to change her opinion. Only now did she realize how close the children were to their mother and how distant they were from their father. Tiffany constantly took them places, went on walks with them, helped with their homework, taught them poems, and read them riddles. The children were well developed, and it was all thanks to their mother. When Lauren entered the kitchen, she was struck by the cleanliness. No matter how long Tiffany spent on orders, she always found the time and energy to keep her workspace tidy. Fortunately, there were enough ingredients in the fridge. So, Lauren sent the kids to watch cartoons in the living room and got started with the cooking. "And what do we have here?" she mumbled, finding a thick notebook in one of the drawers. It turned out her daughter-in-law kept meticulous records, listing all her orders and income by month. When Lauren saw the amounts, she exhaled loudly. It turned out that Tiffany was the main breadwinner in the family, not her son. The money Tiffany earned was several times more than Arthur's salary. "My goodness, so many orders," the mother-in-law continued to exclaim. Only then did she realize how much her daughter-in-law had been working. The elderly woman shook her head in guilt. She had been so wrong about Tiffany. It could be said that Tiffany was the one holding the family together. Lauren had always thought she was just living off her husband. Now, she felt ashamed, both of herself and her useless son. She tried calling him again. This time, there was still no response. "Just turn off that phone already," an irritated female voice came from the hotel room. Arthur obediently turned off his smartphone. "Sorry," he said with a guilty smile, "my mom's calling again." "First your mom, then your wife," his lover chuckled. "Are you sure you don't want to go home instead?" "Are you kidding?" "There's nowhere I'd rather be than with you," Arthur quickly reassured her, then kissed her passionately. Meanwhile, Tiffany was also unsuccessfully trying to reach her husband. She was eager to share the results of her negotiations, but Arthur was unavailable. "What's going on?" she frowned, repeatedly dialing his number. "You're doing great," Gerald quietly said. "Your husband's successes are usually much more modest." Tiffany didn't respond to the jab about Arthur, but the compliment towards her was appreciated. "So what should I do now?" she said, feeling a bit lost. "The negotiations are over. Does that mean I can head back? Or do I need to talk to someone else?" "Usually, your husband calls our director after the meeting," Gerald explained, "and then a decision is made." Since Tiffany thought her husband had already arranged everything with the boss, she had no hesitation asking Gerald for the director's number and calling herself. "Good evening, Kevin, this is Tiffany. I'm calling to report the results of the negotiations," she said, holding the phone to her ear. To her surprise, there was confusion on the other end of the line. At first, the director didn't even realize who he was speaking with, and when he found out that Arthur had sent his wife in his place, he became seriously angry. "Has Arthur lost his mind?" the boss exploded. Tiffany panicked and jumped out of the car to get some air. There, she reported on her successes, and finally, the boss softened. "I'll see you in the office." You can tell me everything in detail there, he said before hanging up. Is everything okay? The driver asked, looking at Tiffany. She was flushed from the stress, and beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. Now it is, Tiffany sighed. Let's go to the office. Despite the situation, Tiffany had made an excellent impression. She performed much better than some experienced employees who had been working in this field for years. In fact, she completely overshadowed her ineffective husband. Kevin now considered Tiffany a gift of fate that shouldn't be missed. That's why he made her a lucrative offer. I want you to become a full-time employee, he said, outlining all the terms, with a special emphasis on the salary. Tiffany couldn't deny that his words piqued her interest, but she already had a job she loved, which took up a lot of her time and energy. She simply couldn't split herself in two, and, though it made her uncomfortable, she had to decline. I'm sorry, but I can't abandon my clients, Tiffany replied, remembering that her schedule was already filled with orders for several weeks ahead. She simply didn't have time for anything else, and she wasn't yet ready to sacrifice her life and sleep. However, Kevin wouldn't have made it to such a position if he easily accepted defeat. So, the director gave her an ultimatum: either she accepted his offer, or Arthur would be disgracefully kicked out of the company. And with his skill set, it would be hard for him to find a decent position anytime soon. That's not fair, she exclaimed. Isn't it? The boss smirked. Your husband keeps failing negotiations. Because of his past mistake, a batch of poor quality goods was purchased. And I haven't even mentioned how he blatantly deceives the management by sending someone else on business trips in his place. Do you still think I'm being unfair? Tiffany blushed deeply. She couldn't deny that there was more truth than anything else in the words of the director. Arthur really had proven himself to be a terrible employee, and now, to avoid making things worse, she had no choice but to accept the offer. All right, you've won, Tiffany replied, and she did it only for Arthur, who could get incredibly angry over this turn of events or, worse yet, fall into a depression. When Tiffany stepped outside, she was surprised to find that Gerald had been waiting for her all this time. Let me give you a ride home, the driver offered, and Tiffany happily agreed. As they drove, she shared the news with him. Congratulations, Gerald said sincerely. She shrugged uncertainly, not entirely sure whether she should be congratulated, as Tiffany hadn't been aiming to get a job offer from them. When they arrived, Tiffany saw her mother-in-law and children playing happily in the yard. A warm smile instantly appeared on her face, and the young mother forgot her worries and how exhausted she was from the entire day. Thank you for the ride, she said. I think we'll be seeing each other more often now. The driver nodded. He liked the prospect of that. As soon as the children saw her, they rushed toward her, almost knocking her over with their hugs. Gerald was about to drive away, but he hesitated, unable to look away from the wonderful scene. How I've missed you. Tiffany smiled, kissing each of them in turn. I hope you behaved yourselves. Did you listen to Daddy? Only then did she realize she hadn't seen Arthur. When her mother-in-law explained everything, Tiffany frowned. She, too, wasn't pleased that her husband had left the children alone. Now, she planned to have a serious conversation with him. How did it go? Lauren asked, steering the conversation away from the awkward topic. Tiffany began to share her successes, and her mother-in-law was incredibly proud of her. You're very talented, Tiffany, her mother-in-law finally admitted. After a moment of silence, she added, I'm sorry, dear. Tiffany didn't need further explanation. She understood perfectly. Although her mother-in-law never voiced her complaints out loud, Tiffany often picked up on them from just a glance or the occasional sharp comment. But now, Lauren truly regretted her past behavior. Tiffany smiled, showing that she didn't hold a grudge. All right, I see everyone's had their fun, Lauren said, glancing at the grandchildren. So, it's time for dinner. Tiffany was also ready to eat, as the only meal she'd had that day was during the negotiations in the morning. At first, they wanted to wait for Arthur to sit down for dinner together, but since his phone was off, they decided to eat without him. Arthur showed up late at night, by which time Tiffany had left a few missed calls on his phone and the children were already asleep. Arthur was drunk, and to stay on his feet, he had to lean against the wall. The smell of alcohol was so strong that Tiffany instinctively took a few steps back to avoid inhaling it. "Oh, Tiffany," he slurred, giving a crooked smile. "What are you doing home so early?" He didn't expect her to return the same day, as it usually took him at least 3 days to finish negotiations. Tiffany didn't want to talk to him while he was in this state, so she suggested going to bed and discussing everything in the morning. "No way," he declared, sitting down on the floor. "I want to know everything right now. What if you messed it all up?" Tiffany sighed heavily and started explaining. She expected her report to please him, but instead, he got angry. He jumped to his feet suddenly, stumbling. "Have you lost your mind?" Arthur shouted. "Why did you even talk to the boss? Now he's going to skin me alive. You're such an idiot." He kept shouting loudly. Tiffany worried that his yelling might wake the children, so she gently closed all the doors and tried to lead her drunken husband to the kitchen, which was farthest from the kids' room. "Don't touch me, traitor." Arthur continued to rage. "Arthur, enough." Tiffany sighed. "I did what I had to do, and you're the last person who should judge me." She placed a glass of water and a pill in front of him. When he finally calmed down, he collapsed on the couch and immediately started snoring. Tiffany, with a heavy heart, went to bed. She understood that there would now be serious tension between her and Arthur. What's more, she had no idea how she would balance her new job with making cakes, which she couldn't bring herself to give up. In the morning, when Tiffany woke up, her husband was already sitting in the kitchen. His face was puffy and his gaze unfocused. He kept frowning and touching his temples. "How much did you drink that you feel this bad?" she thought to herself. Tiffany made coffee and was about to set the cup down next to her husband when her attention was drawn to a burgundy mark on his neck. A bruise? Tiffany mentally wondered, though she didn't really believe it. No, it wasn't a bruise, this was a full-on hickey. At that moment, her hand trembled, and the hot drink spilled onto the table, reaching Arthur's palm. "Tiffany," he immediately exclaimed. "What, are you completely clumsy?" She could barely hear him. There was some kind of ringing in her ears. Her breath became shallow, and the only thought in her mind was, "Arthur is cheating on me." Tiffany shook her head a little to collect herself and started cleaning up the spill. "What's this?" she asked in a cold, steely voice, pointing to his neck. Arthur frowned and looked into the mirror, trying to figure out what his wife was referring to at this ungodly hour. As soon as he realized what she had seen, his face went pale. "I don't know, must have bumped into something," he mumbled uncertainly. "Bumped into something, huh?" Tiffany said sarcastically. "And whose lips hit you like that?" He suddenly jumped up, pretending to rush to work. "Stop talking nonsense," Arthur muttered. "Anyway, I'm late. I need to run." "Arthur, the conversation isn't over," she shouted, but he was already gone. It hurt so much that Tiffany tightly gripped the rag, causing more coffee to spill down her elbow. She closed her eyes, desperately trying to hold back her tears, but it didn't work. Watching the scene was her mother-in-law. She pursed her lips, having gone through something similar with Arthur's father years ago. Back then, Lauren had swallowed her pride and found the strength to save the family for the sake of her son. She expected the same kind of sacrifice from her daughter-in-law. "Tiffany, whatever you're feeling right now, don't make any impulsive decisions," Lauren said softly. Tiffany frowned. "Are you asking me to just swallow all of this?" she asked angrily, wiping away her tears. "For the sake of the family, a lot can be forgiven," the elderly woman sighed. The sounds from the children's room signaled that the kids had woken up. Tiffany immediately began to compose herself so the children wouldn't realize she had been crying. "Go to work peacefully," her mother-in-law's hand rested gently on her shoulder. "I'll take them to school and kindergarten." Tiffany nodded gratefully and rushed to get ready. Today was her first official workday. When she arrived at the office, her boss gathered all the employees and introduced the new colleague. "Friends, since we have a new addition to the team, I need to inform you about some personnel changes," Kevin announced. Arthur learned that he was being transferred to another department. Now, he would no longer have business trips, but would be dealing with numerous documents that needed to be reviewed. Of course, this affected his salary, which was cut by almost a third, and he was far from pleased about it. "Kevin, can we talk?" an offended employee asked, barely holding back his anger. "Not now," the director waved him off. "I need to show Tiffany her new workspace." Tiffany couldn't help but notice her husband's pale face. "Well, serves you right," she thought, feeling a sense of vindication as she followed her boss. Once everyone had dispersed, Arthur slammed his fist on the table with all his might. He was furious. He had been shamelessly stripped of a position that he had actually enjoyed. He loved the romance of business trips. Being away from home meant he could freely meet new people without worrying that some well-meaning acquaintance would tell his wife about it. And business trips always came with a nice bonus to his salary. But now, all of that was taken away from him. And who did it? His own wife, who didn't even care about those perks. Meanwhile, Tiffany started to settle into her new role. She hadn't been sent on any business trips yet, but she was given the task of establishing relationships with local suppliers. She attended several meetings, each of which positively affected the company's results. Tiffany could clearly tell when she was being offered quality products and a good deal, and when someone was trying to cheat her, so she didn't make mistakes. She didn't succumb to persuasion or offers to take kickbacks. "I'm very pleased with you," the boss said during the lunch break. "If things keep going like this, you'll get a bonus this month." Tiffany shyly smiled. She hadn't expected things to go this smoothly. Gerald, who was nearby, winked at her in greeting. However, not everyone was happy with the new employee's success. Her husband cursed the day he had sent her on that business trip. "Bitch," he hissed, watching as his wife chatted amiably with the management. "I agree," a disgruntled female voice came from just a couple of centimeters away. Arthur turned in surprise and noticed Carla Andreevna, who had been the constant deputy director for many years. She was in this position because whenever a young and ambitious woman appeared on the horizon, the older lady swiftly took care of her. She couldn't tolerate competition in any form and always aimed to suppress it from the very beginning. Everyone knew that when it came to weaving intrigues, Carla was unmatched. Therefore, other employees avoided any quarrels or conflicts with her, knowing it was too dangerous to cross her. After all, the boss highly valued and trusted her. "Let's step outside," Arthur suggested, and the woman nodded in agreement. Thus, Arthur gained a loyal ally, whose cunning could outmatch many. They both agreed that Tiffany should not last long in the company. She had to be removed as soon as possible. "I hope there won't be any problems with the fact that she's your wife?" Carla squinted at him. Arthur shook his head. He was willing to do anything as long as Tiffany returned to her cakes and stopped hanging around his office. A couple of days later, the deputy director devised a plan to discredit the new employee. It was quite harsh, but her husband agreed anyway. Kevin sent Tiffany to an important meeting with partners, with whom he typically communicated only himself. However, the woman had so impressed him and earned his trust that he believed she was the one who could handle it. Tiffany was flattered by this trust. She was handed a heavy bag, which contained a large sum of money. She was to deliver it after the contract was signed. When she saw the amount, her eyes nearly popped out of her head. Tiffany had never held such a large sum of money in her life. "This is enough to buy several of my apartments," she thought, deeply impressed. For a moment, she even felt nervous about carrying such money to the meeting. However, once she learned that Gerald would be driving her, Tiffany exhaled. "Well, then everything will definitely be fine," she thought to herself. Gerald often drove her to meetings. The man no longer stayed silent, and they frequently talked about various topics. Tiffany enjoyed these conversations, and sometimes she caught herself thinking that she was looking forward to going to work just so she could see Gerald. She was about to get in the car when Carla suddenly called out to her. "Tiffany, could I ask you for a small favor?" she said with a plaintive tone. Tiffany set her bag down on the back seat and turned back to her colleague. "What do you need?" she replied readily. "Can you buy me this medicine?" The woman handed her a note with the name of the medication. "My head is splitting, and I can't leave my workplace right now. Important people are expected soon." "Of course," Tiffany smiled, "I'll stop on the way back." Just as she was about to head to the car, Carla suddenly hugged her tightly. Tiffany was slightly surprised, but returned the hug. "Thank you, darling," her older colleague said, touched. Finally, Tiffany and Gerald set off. This time, the driver was unusually quiet, even though they had long since crossed the line of silence and usually chatted during the drive. Tiffany decided not to press him, thinking that maybe something was bothering him. Yet a small unease crept into her mind. She buried herself in her phone, trying to distract herself and pass the time until the meeting with the partners. At first, everything went well, perfect, even. The partners were immediately charmed by the young and beautiful employee who also clearly knew her stuff. You could say Tiffany won them over. "I'm ready to sign whatever you say," one of the businessmen smirked. Tiffany smiled back and handed over the money. But as soon as the partners opened the bag, their friendly demeanor evaporated. When one of them reached in and pulled out a couple of ordinary papers wrapped in a rubber band, Tiffany's face went as pale as the paper. "Is this how you tried to trick us?" The man who had once complimented her now trembled with anger. Tiffany was speechless. Her forehead was covered in sweat, and her heart felt like it was about to leap out of her chest. "How is this possible? I saw the director himself count the money, then put it in the bag." She couldn't understand what had happened. "Jay, call the police immediately," one of the men ordered, and his words snapped Tiffany back to reality. "Wait, no police," she pleaded. "This is some monstrous misunderstanding. I don't even know how this happened. But we'll figure it out, you'll get your money." But no matter what she said, no one was listening to her. The evidence was more convincing than any words. Tiffany's protests seemed useless. The conversation continued in the police station. She explained everything from the beginning to the end. Then, they called the director, who had handed her the package for the deal. "I'm very disappointed in you, Tiffany," Kevin said, stunned. "You showed such great promise, but it seems all of it was a ruse to deceive me when the time came." He apologized to the partners, saying that he himself had been deceived. Tiffany was accused of fraud and stealing money. She was so shocked that she could barely move her lips. At one point, she even had a panic attack. She faced a massive fine. They demanded the money back. And there was the looming threat of prison time. Tiffany kept turning it all over in her mind. And she was truly terrified. "Wait. It's not like that at all." Suddenly, Gerald's voice rang out in the police station. Tiffany looked up. When the negotiation started, he had left without waiting for her, which is why she hadn't seen him since. "She was set up," the driver continued. "I personally overheard 2 employees plotting to steal the money." The police then invited Gerald to give a statement, and he told them in detail about the conversation he had heard between Arthur and Carla. They shook hands, thinking their plan had worked. They had managed to get rid of the unwanted employee while also pocketing a significant sum. "Is that possible?" the police officer asked, looking at the director. "You should probably know better what your employees are capable of." Kevin pursed his lips. In reality, as much as he disliked Carla, he understood that she was far from innocent and could step over anyone to achieve her goals. And as for Arthur, there was nothing to say. That man was utterly untrustworthy. The boss would have gotten rid of him a long time ago if it weren't for the promise he made to his former classmate. "It's possible," he was forced to admit. Tiffany was released, but they were in no rush to completely clear her of suspicion. She was placed under travel restrictions and couldn't leave the city. Tiffany wanted to thank Gerald for standing up for her, but as soon as she stepped out of the station, he was nowhere to be found. There was nothing left for her but to go home. She was ready to say everything she thought about her husband. He could insult her, spend time with other women, but now he had put her freedom in jeopardy, and that changed everything. Maybe Tiffany could forgive some things, but not this, and she was now ready to end the marriage. Arthur, sensing the storm, decided to stay with his mistress. At home, Tiffany was only greeted by her mother-in-law. The day full of stress had taken its toll on her appearance. She was disheveled and worn out, which deeply worried Lauren. "Sweetheart, what happened to you?" she asked, concerned. As soon as Tiffany looked at herself in the mirror, she broke down in tears. All the tension she had experienced that day came crashing down on her at once. She remembered the disappointment from her boss, the suspicions from the partners, the harsh interrogation by the police officer, and Gerald's story about her husband's betrayal. Her mother-in-law immediately began to comfort her. "How could you raise such a monster?" The only thing Tiffany could utter. Lauren swallowed hard, realizing that her son had made another mistake. She gave her some calming medicine and water, then asked her to tell everything in order, which Tiffany did. The older woman was shocked. "You still think I should save this marriage?" Tiffany asked bitterly. Her mother-in-law had no answer to that. She took a deep breath, realizing that this marriage was doomed. What Arthur had done was unforgivable. No. The answer came after a long silence, which only made Tiffany offer a sad smile. When they were done, Tiffany locked herself in her room and tried calling Gerald. She desperately wanted to hear his voice. She was certain that only he could calm her down. "Why aren't you answering?" Tiffany asked, leaving several missed calls. However, the only response she got was the metallic voice of the voicemail, which didn't clarify anything. Meanwhile, Gerald was waiting for Arthur. He was determined to have a serious conversation with him to explain how one should never treat a woman. The situation with Tiffany had disturbed the driver. He realized how dangerous and ruthless her husband could be, and didn't want her to get hurt. "So, what do you want?" Arthur swaggered toward his opponent. "We know you set all of this up," Gerald said through gritted teeth. "You framed your own wife." Arthur understood that he wasn't called here for a friendly chat, so he was prepared. While the driver wasn't paying attention, an unfamiliar man quietly approached him from behind, and Arthur signaled to him that it was time to act. "What do you want from me?" Arthur continued to mock him. "Either act like a man, or get out and stop tormenting her," Gerald hissed. Arthur laughed. "So, you're after my position, huh?" he asked brazenly. Gerald started to move threateningly toward him. But at that moment, he was struck treacherously from behind. The man bent over in pain. Then Arthur hit him on the head, knocking him to the ground. He had planned for this, bringing along his mistress's brother to back him up. Gerald tried to rise, but more blows rained down on him. "Take it easy, or you will kill him," the mistress's brother said, seeing how Arthur mercilessly kicked the fallen man. "Arthur, enough already." In the end, he had to literally drag him away from Gerald, who was already barely breathing. By nature, Arthur was a coward. The beating of a defenseless opponent only proved this. He would never have stood his ground in a fair fight with Gerald, so he resorted to trickery. "You'll never get my wife, you idiot," Arthur hissed directly into his ear. "She's staying with me. And I'll do whatever I want. If I want, I'll have you thrown in jail for fraud, and no little punk like you will stop me." Arthur felt like he was in control. First, he had set up his wife so skillfully, and now he had dealt with Gerald. He truly felt proud of himself and was even planning to have a drink to celebrate. However, fate decided to bring him back to reality. A few moments later, a police car appeared in front of him. His accomplice was physically in better shape and had prudently managed to escape, so Arthur had to face the consequences alone. "Arthur," the officer in uniform said, "you are accused of theft and of causing harm to another person." Arthur was in shock. He started frantically searching for an escape route, but he was surrounded from all sides. The way to flee was blocked. But how? he said in confusion. Arthur was sure he had planned everything carefully. What could have gone wrong? How did the police get here? Who tipped them off? In fact, Gerald hadn't invited him here to beat him. He had a clear plan. The driver had previously set up his phone nearby and started a live stream, which was shown on the chief's screen and also duplicated on the other computers in the office. Gerald wanted to get a confession from Arthur to prove that Tiffany was innocent. But the plan went a little off course. Frightened employees had called the police to stop Arthur from killing Gerald. An ambulance had also arrived with them, and they took Gerald to the hospital. Meanwhile, Tiffany was at home. If it weren't for a colleague she had become friends with, she wouldn't have known anything. When the colleague forwarded her the live stream, Tiffany couldn't contain her scream. She was very worried about Gerald. She immediately headed to the hospital to check on him. The image of Arthur finishing Gerald off kept flashing in front of her eyes. She squeezed her eyes shut to try to forget it. She couldn't believe her husband could be so vile and cruel. My God, how did I live so many years with such a monster? Tiffany kept asking herself as she drove to the hospital. Fortunately, Gerald's injuries were not life-threatening. However, he looked impressive. His lip was split open, and his entire face was covered in scratches, making it swollen and red. But the most important thing was that his internal organs were unharmed, and there was no internal bleeding. The hospital was strict, so they didn't want to let Tiffany see him at first. Desperate, she claimed to be his fiancée just so they would allow her to see him. Gerald was completely bandaged and breathing heavily. The moment she saw him, all her emotions reflected on her face at once. Tiffany couldn't suppress a gasping breath and covered her lips with her hand. "Do I look that bad?" He smirked. Tiffany shook her head vigorously and then sat down on the edge of the bed. "Does it hurt a lot?" she asked softly, trying her best not to cry. Tiffany understood very well that he had suffered because of her. "Not at all," Gerald continued to smile. "Are you lying?" Tiffany sighed, carefully looking him over. They sat in silence for a while, and then Gerald spoke again. "You know, when they told me my fiancée was coming, I was really surprised," he said, "but I had no doubt it would be you." "Well, how else was I supposed to get through?" The woman threw up her hands. "You've got a whole team of nurses guarding you here." Gerald laughed loudly, but the sound was followed by pain in his right side. Tiffany quickly realized this and helped him adjust to a more comfortable position. Now that she was sure he was all right, she knew it was time to leave. However, she didn't want to leave at all because only with him did she feel truly at peace. At one point, Gerald took her hand and kissed it, and she felt her heart miss a beat. "What do you plan to do next?" Gerald asked. More than anything, he was afraid to hear that Tiffany intended to go back to her husband, because now he wasn't going to let her go. "Divorce," she said sarcastically, which made her conversation partner laugh again. Despite having children together, their divorce was quite quick. Arthur's reputation was, to put it mildly, tarnished. So, he didn't harbor any illusions about being able to get custody of the children. During the hearing, he sat with his head lowered, agreeing to all the terms set by Tiffany's lawyer. Now he had a criminal record, a suspended sentence, and a large fine to pay. Therefore, Arthur wasn't focused on fighting his ex-wife. Tiffany, on the other hand, left the courthouse feeling elated. She was now free and happy. "Tiffany, you'll still let me see the grandchildren, won't you?" Lauren asked anxiously. Tiffany's heart tightened. She truly felt sorry for her mother-in-law, who was also horrified by her son's actions. Tiffany had no grievances against her, and so she had no intention of restricting her communication with the grandchildren, who adored their grandmother. Of course, her former daughter-in-law quickly reassured her, anytime. Despite the complexity of the situation, they managed to remain on good terms, and Lauren continued to spend time with the children. Tiffany, in turn, wished her happiness in her personal life. The elderly woman held the deepest affection for her, and she was glad that her daughter-in-law had freed herself from a husband who didn't deserve her. Arthur is my son, so it's my cross to bear for the rest of my life, but this girl deserves better, the elderly mother thought. After the divorce, Tiffany hurried to the hospital to share the good news with Gerald. She knew he, more than anyone else, longed for her freedom. Their relationship was slowly blossoming, and for them to take the next step, it was important that Tiffany let go of her husband's last name, which she had successfully done. Gerald was thrilled. Finally, he could officially call this woman his. As soon as he was discharged from the hospital, they started seeing each other. But they didn't rush to formalize their relationship because Tiffany was very concerned about the children's reaction and wanted them to meet her new partner first. At first, the kids felt disoriented and asked a lot of questions, to which Tiffany had to answer honestly. However, when they saw how happy their mother had become, how often she laughed and smiled thanks to Gerald, they grew to love him too. A little later, they got married and became a true family. The man accepted the children as his own and happily spent time with them. Tiffany, however, left her company despite the director's pleas and his assurances that a fantastic future and great career growth awaited her. She didn't need any of that. "I just want to do what I love," Tiffany replied. She didn't want to experience stress anymore, and that job only served to remind her of the suffering from her past. So, Tiffany continued making cakes, bringing festive cheer and joy to her clients. Her customer base grew even more, thanks to the reliable helpers she had gained, Gerald and her former mother-in-law, who began spending more time with her grandchildren. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.